The historic United Nations climate change agreement reached over the weekend means the world will soon be going on a reduced carbon diet. Governments will have to make good on the promises they made in Paris and begin the hard work of delivering a national climate plan. The voluntary deal comes into effect in 2020 and aims to limit global warming from rising above 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels, accelerating to 1.5 degrees over the longer term. Those targets will require $16.5 trillion US be spent on renewables and energy efficiencies by 2030. That, according to the International Energy Agency. That means governments will have to offer incentives for clean energy production, scale back on fossil fuels, make emissions more costly, and reduce deforestation. And while Canada generates less than 2% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, Environment Canada says we're one of the highest per capita emitters because of our size, the weather, and resource-based economy. Tom Rand is the Senior Advisor for the Mars Clean Tech Venture Fund, and Ken Green is the Senior Director of the Center of Resource Studies at the Fraser Institute. Gentlemen, welcome. Tom, I want to begin with you. $16.5 trillion, it is an enormous sum. How does it break down?
Sounds like a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, to put that in context, that's from the International Energy Agency, and compare that to the 30 to 40 trillion they say will already need to be spent on energy infrastructure. So it's about half of that again. That's related to what they call their 450 scenario, which is really limiting warming to around 2 degrees. And that includes a lot of capital investments, in particular in energy efficiency. So there's a capital cost to them, but they also calculate that the net benefit, because those efficiencies bring out cost savings over time, the net benefit is actually something on the order of 20 trillion on the positive side of the ledger.
Ken, what do you make of the cost-benefit equation?
Well, you know, politicians are great at making promises, but they can't actually change the nature of reality. So they can't wish less expensive renewables into existence. They can't wish carbon capture at industrial scale into existence. They can't wish electrical storage, battery storage at industrial scale into existence. So when the ink on all this dries, then after the new year is rung in and people start to look at what they can actually do without crippling their economy, they're going to find that these pledges they've made are pretty far out of reach, especially the 2-degree target for limit for warming and much less the 1.5-degree target for maximum warming.
It's fair to say they can't wish things into existence, but they can have a vision. The easy way out here is the cynicism. The vision is really hard. Do you think at least there's some vision here to tackle the problem?
I think there is vision. I think, you know, that now every one of these conferences has the same exact narrative. At the end of the day, they all come together. They agree on some sort of non-binding commitments, and they agree to meet again. And that's what has happened here. We have no binding commitments. We have no binding timelines. We have no binding financial commitments into the years ahead. So I think the vision is there in plenty. But again, the vision has to be tempered with reality. And the reality is that we, developed countries especially, are societies that are powered by abundant and affordable energy. 97% of the world's transportation is based on oil, and over 80% of the world's electricity comes from fossil fuels. And we have 2.5 billion people who don't have enough energy right now, with another 2 billion population coming, according to the future projections of the global population. So having a vision is great, but having that vision tempered by the reality and the real need to provide real power for real people, I think that's even more important.
Where's the balance for you, Tom?
Well, looking in the rearview mirror isn't the best way of telling where you're going, right? So, of course, fossil fuels are a big part of our economy. That's why we have work to do. If they weren't a big part, there wouldn't be any work to do. What's interesting about this agreement is to look at what they were unanimous about. Think of how hard it is to generate unanimity. You couldn't get unanimity in Parliament, in Congress. These are 200 nations who are unanimous about the following ideas, right? 2 degrees is kind of a limit that they need to hit. The emissions targets reductions they've brought, which are voluntary, are not enough. They've acknowledged and are legally bound to be transparent about emissions and how they're hitting their targets. So they're legally bound to show the world what they're doing, which means they're bound to their citizens and we're bound to each other. Of course, governments can't wish things into being. The government's job is to set market conditions to allow entrepreneurs and financiers and business people to bring those things into fruition. It's happened in the past. It'll happen now. So the trick now, President Hollande is already putting together a coalition of the willing to get the big countries to talk about how they're going to coordinate pricing carbon, how we build a larger and larger carbon market, for example, which will unlock the kind of entrepreneurial creativity that makes the wish into a kind of a market mandate. And that's what's really interesting, right? right? And to have the mandate so unanimous, and to have Canada's Minister McKenna playing a central role in shepherding those negotiations over the finish line at the end, puts Canada back at center stage, right?
Ken, is that the role of government, do you think, to set the market conditions? I have a hunch you might disagree with that. Am I right?
Yes, because that's sort of not, that takes you from capitalism basically into socialism, right? The government is not supposed to set market conditions. The markets are supposed to from the ground up, develop market conditions. Anything else is just a regulatory state.
Is a price on carbon socialism? Is a price on carbon socialism?
It's a regulatory state. You're setting a politically set derived limit, and you're creating a market.
Is that a bad thing? You think a price on carbon is a bad thing, given that climate is a risk?
If I mandated that every house has a buggy whip above the door,
that's not what I said. No, I'm talking about a
right?
price on carbon, which is a market signal, right? Which allows the creativity of the market to solve this problem.
Well,
do you think a price on carbon
is
socialism? I don't understand that.
All taxes are a market signal, right? They're a signal that the government is taking money.
Right.
How
is that bad?
if we were talking completely abstractly and economically, we could almost certainly agree on one approach being less harmful to the economy than others, and pricing is probably in that category of less harmful than cap and trade, less harmful than regulation. But nonetheless, the research still shows that it's an economic drag on the economy. Right now, the world's economies are not in the greatest shape. And there are an awful lot of people who are living in energy poverty, and not only in the developed world, but all of the developing world. I don't think this is the right time to be pricing the input to all things.
Right. So
carbon is the input to every single thing we do. Everything we make, every drug we take, every refrigerator we build, every car we drive.
Thank you. If you take climate risk seriously, if you think climate is a risk, which the experts tell us it is, how do you solve that problem other than setting market signals in place to solve that problem? I don't understand. I mean, do we ignore the problem just because it's hard to do? I don't get it.
We've had this discussion before, and it's interesting because the Paris Statement says that there needs to be much more focus on adaptation and resilience building in societies around the world.
They said let's stop at 2 degrees.
I'm just going to interrupt you
there. And that's absolutely right.
They said let's stop at 2 degrees. That was their primary.
Okay, I'm going to say, so we have in this country a number of provinces who are making moves on cap and trade or carbon tax, whatever they're doing. What should the federal plan look like, Tom?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think the feds will play a role now. The provinces have already taken a lead in coordinating provincial action and providing incentives from the center. So a green bank, green infrastructure. As the federal government procures technology, it should favor green technology. It should certainly look to EDC, Export Development Canada, because the economic opportunity underpinning this change is enormous, and EDC can play a critical role as Canadian technology companies export technology that solves this problem, and I think that's a key piece for Ottawa to do.
Ken, you've asserted that 2 degrees Celsius at that temperature, it would leave 85% of the oil sands in the ground, which would represent an economic issue for the province that you live in and for this country at large. How do you support that assertion?
Well, I should say, first of all, that wasn't me. That actually was an article in Nature magazine by a team of scientists who calculated how much of the world's fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground to achieve that 2 degrees C upper limit. At 1.5 degrees, it's hard to see how Canada develops any of its remaining fossil fuel reserves in any significant way because it's such a steep challenge to reduce emissions to that level. I would say also, I think there's a mistake been made in Paris, which is rather than talking about tons of emission reductions, they have their pledges, but now they have actually said we're going to control the Earth's thermostat. We're going to grab a hold of the dial and keep it from going above 2 degrees. When we understand not very much about the whole Earth's climate system, there's a lot of huge unknowns. And so I think they're setting themselves up for possibly a fall from hubris because they have basically changed their target from something they can control, their emissions, to something they can't control.
I'm going to leave you each with one last point, and here's the question. Paris is signed. We now move into the future. You may not like what was done over the weekend, but here it is. Ken, first to you, Tom, then to you. What is the number one thing we need to focus on, assuming that that is set?
I think the number one thing we need to focus on is research and development to find less expensive forms of the renewable energies that we're now committing to move to. I think we need to build social resilience by making sure that we institute full pricing of all of our natural resources, such as water and such as timber and fish and everything else. And I think we need to figure out ways to make society more resilient. And generally speaking, that's by building a much more robust economy, which makes people more resilient to all kinds of change.
That was more than one, but I'll give it to you. Tom, one more thing.
Well, aside from pricing carbon, I think Canada needs to think about clean energy technology as underpinning a significant economic revolution. And if we get our ducks lined up, we stand to gain an enormous economic advantage by exporting Canadian technology to solve this problem.
Gentlemen, thank you.